Brian Jones, 1969, for God's sake. But I think it's important to sort of reestablish his bona fides as not only the founder of the Rolling Stones, but he was the flamboyant one. He was
Yeah.
the charmer. But the management of the Rolling Stones quite quickly figured out, well, wait a minute, he's not the lead vocalist. The lead vocalist has to be the one with the swagger and that moves like Jagger.
Right.
Brian Jones had Shopton Savile Row, and he had the flamboyant, almost androgynous outfits, and he had the moves, the dance moves. That was all sort of taken from him by Keith, by Mick and Keith.
Yeah.
So it's important to us to reestablish that and to give him his due. Now, having said that, Brian Jones was he was a rogue, and he was at times intolerable to be around. That's the duality of genius sometimes. You've got like Mozart and, I don't know, Jack the Ripper sort of wrapped up into one. Not that he was a murderer, but you get
Right.
what I'm saying. Like there's the shadow, and then there is the brilliance. And it comes together in genius, and genius can be very difficult to live with. And he was. And so he was kicked out of the band because he just couldn't function.
Well, I know we teased starting with Kurt, but maybe, we'll get to Kurt in a minute, because I feel like this leaves us. Let's talk about him. I was thrown by that, not knowing, you mentioned that in the book, that Mick kind of watched him doing his flamboyant act and said, all right, well, that's what I'll do. It was also fascinating, the overlap. You forget these are all businesses and businessmen and people, or, whether the artists are doing their own business or have people doing it on their behalf. And it felt like, you described the setting where Brian was off in his country home, and basically Mick and Keith showed up at his door and said, like, you're out. And it felt like this very, almost like a scene out of a movie, where there's just like the worker comes into the boardroom and says, sorry, here's your severance package, you're out, and he's like, okay, and had seen it coming, because then you talk about how they had been using him less and less as he, became less part of the band. But let's get into, so can you set the scene for, and I don't know how much you want to give away, what's in the book. I do want people to go get the book, so I won't ask you to like reveal the book's secrets, but can you talk a little bit, set that story up?
I'll tell you as much as you want to know. As someone who's been on the other side interviewing people, it's always been kind of a pet peeve of mine, is people that want to hold back. Obviously I want people to read, to buy the book and read the book, but I'd like to give the gold away as much as I possibly can,
Great.
As much as time allows. So Brian Jones retreats to the Sussex estate, the home of the great British writer A.A. Milne. Of course, we're familiar with Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin, and it was in need of massive renovations, and he had this crew of, some of them were, let's say, a little unsavory, some of these characters, and they saw this rich kid from London with his, speaking proper Queen's English, come into this rural part of England, and they thought, this guy's ripe for the taking. So they were a little unscrupulous, and they were milking Brian Jones for everything they could get. And by this time, he's very vulnerable. He's into the brandy, and he's maybe popping some pills, and he didn't handle his drugs and alcohol well, like, say, for example, Keith Richards, who, as the old line goes, if there's, when the World War III comes after the nuclear apocalypse, the only thing standing will be cockroaches, Keith Richards, and maybe the milk cans at Coney Island. But so he was in a vulnerable state, and as you pointed out, when he would show up in studio, sometimes they wouldn't even plug in his amplifier. He couldn't play anymore, and he got sidelined because also he couldn't write songs. And it was fine for the Rolling Stones to be a cover band for the first couple of albums. They were a blues cover band, and they were great. But then they needed to start writing their own music, and that wasn't Brian's forte. So he quickly read the writing on the wall, and he got pushed aside. Also, the police in London they're not taking lightly to these long hairs who are exerting this negative influence on their children. And so any chance they could get to, maybe plant some drugs on some musicians, even though, they were taking them anyway, in some cases, plant some marijuana and so forth and haul them off to jail. They did that to Brian, and so he wasn't able to leave the country, and the Rolling Stones had a big tour coming up in the United States, so he couldn't make that. So Keith and Mick go down, and I think it was Keith basically. Mick was kind of talking, around the periphery of the issue, and Keith, being as blunt as he is, just said, I think the term he used was "cock, you're out." And there's an apocryphal story that things got kind of rough, and Keith Richards, who keeps a blade in his boot, which is true, he pulled that blade out and he supposedly held it to Brian Jones' throat. That, as best as I can determine, never happened, but it makes for a great story.
Yeah. Well, so let me just stop you real quick. So when you hear that, and then that's sort of become part of the narrative, what's your process about, like, all right, who do I talk to? How do I figure out if this is real?
Well, I spoke with Jeffrey Giuliano. There's 2 or 3 great authors and researchers I leaned on in this chapter and initially the podcast. Jeffrey Giuliano wrote a great book about Brian Jones, Painted Black. I think it was called Painted Black, The Murder of Brian Jones. And Jeffrey Giuliano knew and knows a lot of sort of the Rolling Stones inner circle and people that were good friends of Brian Jones. So I'm not getting it firsthand, obviously, because Brian is no longer with us,
Right.
but I felt like I was getting from a pretty reliable source. And
Gotcha.
I mean, if someone's writing a book, that story's gold. I mean, the idea that Keith pulled a blade out of his boot and went at Brian Jones. I mean, the temptation would be to want to believe it. So when someone says, no, it didn't happen that way, to me, that has a lot of credence.
Right. If the movie version of it, that scene is in, with the disclaimer
exactly.
of, like, this is based on the story of.
Exactly.
Okay, sorry, continue.
So things just kind of spiraled down from there. Now, the thing is that Brian took it quite well. He took it all in stride, like he knew it was coming. And he just said, okay, fine. And he made some utterances a short time later that he was going to form this supergroup, maybe with John Lennon and maybe Eric Clapton. It didn't happen. Brian had performed his last days on stage ever. And in the next several weeks, a lot of drinking and trying to get rid of these renovators on his property. And they would just, it was just one big bill after the other. And even though he had been sort of removed from the band, the Rolling Stones headquarters were still sort of overseeing things and paying the odd bill here or there. And so they dispatched a character by the name of Frank Thorogood. Frank Keylock was the fixer with the Rolling Stones. I'm sorry, Tom Keylock.
I was going to say, I think it's brother. Tom. Yeah.
Frank was his brother with Scotland Yard. There's another Frank in the story, but Frank Thorogood. But Tom Keylock was the fixer with the Rolling Stones. And he got kicked out. He got fired by Keith because he was skimming. And so, for example, if the band had to order, furniture for, a recording studio or something, he'd order some for himself and keep it on the bill, and, it'd end up in his apartment. They fired him. So what's Tom Keylock going to do? Well, he figures, maybe I can attach myself to Brian Jones now because, he's kind of out of it and he won't notice if I'm, robbing him blind. So he makes his way down to Cotchford Farm, as the estate was known. And there was a lot of interesting people gathered around that night, some girlfriends, some former girlfriends, a nurse who was kind of Brian's babysitter, really, because he hated to be alone. And some of these workers on the property that just would never leave, including the foreman, whose name was Frank Thorogood, who really didn't like Brian, and he was not a nice person. And there was also, and I won't get too into this, it's in the book, but only just because time doesn't allow. But as it came out later, there was possibly an undercover member of Scotland Yard on the property, which causes a lot of complications in this case, because if you're undercover and something, let's say, the official cause of death was death by misadventure, accidental drowning. But if there was something else going on the property, you can't now announce, we had an undercover cop on the property. If there's a cover up and there's an undercover cop there, it gets very complicated. Well, there was a cover-up, as we can get into. But so Brian decides at a certain point he's going to go for a swim. It's very late. The steam, it's just rising off the pool. He had floodlights on the pool, and it was a very hot and muggy night, and it just looked like the gates of hell had opened up. Brian goes for a swim. Nobody seems to notice. He's missing, and when they finally come out to the pool area, there's Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones, a man who could master any instrument in hours, they said. Never picked up a sitar in his life. He picked it up, and a couple hours later, he's recording.
Yeah.
There he is in the fetal position at the underneath the diving board. And it took them a little while to get him out of the water and onto the pool deck. He remained there for hours and hours and hours. When police arrived, they found, I believe it was Tom Keylock, burning Brian's clothes in a little bonfire off to the side. And what's interesting about this case, just to cut to the chase here, is instead of bringing in the medical examiner from Sussex, that would have been his jurisdiction, the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Heath, appointed his own personal physician to come and do the autopsy. And again, declared death by misadventure, accidental drowning. Now, Brian was an asthmatic. They tried to say that a little bit of alcohol combined with perhaps an asthmatic attack. It really doesn't wash. Brian was an exceptional swimmer, as his former bandmate Bill Wyman could attest. Bill Wyman talked about a tour they went to in Australia, and how Brian would just rush right into the choppy waves and the strong tides. He was never afraid. He was a great swimmer. He was on the high school swim team. He was a great diver as well. And if you look at a swimming pool, it's maybe 1-2 strokes to get to the side. The idea that he couldn't, he had an asthma attack and couldn't make it to the side of the pool doesn't seem plausible. The fact that there was this rush to judgment, and that the Prime Minister seemingly intervened and appointed his own personal physician to do the autopsy. And then we come back to Tom Keylock, the former fixer with the Rolling Stones. His brother, Frank Thorogood, worked with Scotland Yard, was a detective with Scotland Yard. And so there is some suggestion of a cover-up. And I mentioned also there was allegedly an undercover agent on the scene. Was he looking for drugs? We're not really sure at this point. But it gets very complicated and very, how should I say, very sinister, I think, what happened there. And to add to that story, Frank Thorogood, on his deathbed, allegedly, this has not been 100% confirmed, but Frank Thorogood allegedly claimed that he and Brian got into a bit of a tussle in the pool. And whether he struck Brian or he, I don't know, subdued him somehow around the neck and caused him to drown. So not necessarily first-degree murder, but it was definitely not death by misadventure or accidental drowning.
Accidental drowning, yeah.